I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Welcome back, everyone. It's the President's Guy. Today we're going to be taking a look at Agent Flappy's newest video. This one's about a week old right now, and it's the education of every American president. And I'm assuming that he means education before entering office, because most presidents, at least in the modern times, you know, they get honorary degrees and doctorates and things of such of that nature. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of the way things goes. I'm assuming, you know, the first half dozen or so are probably going to be Ivy League graduates. We'll get into the, 8 to 16 and get a bunch of mostly uneducated, or at least, formally educated presidents. And then around the turn of the 20th century, probably get back into that Ivy League education, which will flow mostly up until the modern times. So let's take a look.
From a Michigan football star who won back-to-back championships, to an Ivy League genius with photographic memory, to a president so dumb he graduated at the bottom of his class twice and still became president.
Bush?
This is every U.S. president's education. And spoiler, while some learned from the most elite institutions in the world, others just taught themselves from scratch, like George Washington, whose education was pretty much non-existent. 'Cause after his father died, little George ditched school to help his mom run the farm. But in his free time, he taught himself math, military strategy, and land surveying, which proved lethal when combined with his near photographic memory. 'Cause during the Revolutionary War, Washington effortlessly recalled troop positions, terrain features, and minor details, outsmarting formerly trained British generals on the battlefield. But
Yes, he did do that, but Washington successfully implemented the strategy that a lot of Confederate generals tried, which was prolong the war as long as possible, basically until the government you were trying to escape gave up, and the idea of strategic retreat, basically living to fight another day, that you see someone like Joseph Johnston do, but he never really implemented the fight. Washington was not a great tactician on the battlefield. He often got outsmarted and outflanked, but he definitely knew how to use the advantages he did have. Logistics, terrain, etc. So very educated, and much like we'll see later with Lincoln, self-taught, a voracious reader and consumer of knowledge.
for John Adams, it was the total opposite. 'Cause he attended Harvard at just 15 years old and studied math, philosophy, and history. And after graduating near the top of his class, Adams went on to read law under a local attorney, basically the 18th century version of law school. But he wasn't just a brilliant mind, he was a fiery debater, using his masterful rhetorical skills to argue for American independence. But speaking of brilliant minds, Thomas Jefferson...
And Adams was brilliant, but he was also someone that, if you disagree with him, he was very condescending to you, in many ways similar to Woodrow Wilson in that way, where he was so smart and so educated and so well read that he basically talked down to you and looked down at you if you weren't in compliance with his way of thinking.
Jefferson studied law at William and Mary College, and oh boy was he a voracious reader. Obsessed with everything from architecture to philosophy to languages to science. And when the British burned the Capitol in 1814, Jefferson sold his personal collection of 6,000 books to form the new Library of Congress.
Now that's an impressive library.
But he didn't stop there. He also founded the University of Virginia, personally designing the campus, buildings, and famous rotunda. 'Cause if it wasn't obvious, Jefferson was a polymath, so insanely brilliant that modern psychologists place his IQ around 160, making him one of the smartest presidents in U.S. history. Kinda like
But he was also someone who was an early adopter of the idea of phrenology, and the idea that different races were differently equipped mentally, which obviously is nonsense. So very educated, but very limited to some of the scientific restrictions of knowledge in his time.
James Madison, who went to the College of New Jersey, or what we now call Princeton, where he dove into Latin,
So did Alexander
Greek,
Hamilton.
theology, and completed 4 years of classes in 2 years. But unlike Adams, James Madison wasn't fiery in debate. He was quiet, surgical, and never wasted a word. It was
If you read Ron Chernow's Hamilton, they talk a lot about Jefferson and Madison in there, and how Madison was more of a behind-the-scenes kind of operator, a very small man of stature and a very calculating man, but not very boastful or outgoing in his personality.
It's this combo of being sharp and disciplined that made Madison the perfect man to architect the U.S. Constitution. But while Madison learned in the classroom, James Monroe learned on the job. Because after 2 years of attending William and Mary, 1776 happened. And Madison was like, "Sorry, professors, there's a revolution going on," and left college to join the Continental Army, where he fought in the Battle of Trenton and crossed the Delaware River with Washington. That's him right here holding the flag. But after the revolution, Monroe was famous for having natural political instincts. He was more EQ than IQ. Cause instead of learning from books, Monroe's skill came from people, politics, and practical wisdom. But then came John Quincy Adams, who might be the smartest president in U.S. history. Cause as a kid, Lil Adams traveled with his dad throughout Europe and spoke fluent French, Dutch, and a little German. So when he returned home, he breezed through Harvard in 2 years before launching into politics. But to me, the craziest part about Adams was his morning routine. Because he started every day with a nude swim in the Potomac, then read the Bible in its original Greek, and then wrote in his diary, which ended up becoming a 15,000-page journal. And modern researchers believe Adams had an IQ of around 175, the highest of any U.S. president. So if you want to be as smart as Quincy Adams, maybe just do what he did. Woohoo!
That's funny. Quincy Adams is another one of those people in that category of underwhelming presidents who were highly qualified. He was Secretary of State for James Monroe and actually was the one who basically kind of wrote the Monroe Doctrine. And like he said, very, very educated. Spent 17 years in Congress after being president. And someone, I would put his presidency above his father's, but someone who really was dedicated to public service. You know, you can't argue against John Quincy Adams. I mean, the man literally basically dies on the floor of Congress, you know, during a fiery speech advocating, I forget what it was, because I believe he dies in the 1840s, so it's probably something to do with the Mexican War, but just a ferocious public servant.
Cannonball! But unlike the fancy pants presidents we've seen so far, Andrew Jackson grew up on the rugged frontier with pretty much no education outside of elementary school. Caused by...
And it's not even certain, I don't think, where he was born. I think it's either North or South Carolina, but I don't think it's definitively known.
15 years old, Jackson was orphaned, broke, and fighting to survive. So he became a school teacher himself while studying law at night. But Jackson's true strengths emerged during the War of 1812, where he out-strategized generals despite having zero military training. Cause he was sharp, tough, and street smart. And Jackson applied the same instincts to outmaneuver political opponents and rally the people to his side. So yeah, Jackson didn't have the polish of Adams or Jefferson, but he did have the raw charisma and war hero fame to make him an American legend. Kinda like...
Obviously not the war hero stuff, but he's a lot like Trump in that way, where he's an early adopter of the idea of populism. And he gains national prominence in the War of 1812, but also mostly through his conquests in Florida, fighting piracy, fighting Native Americans, and becoming a hero down there. So much like Washington and Harrison and Grant and Eisenhower rises to prominence being a military leader. So yes, very, again, no formal education really, but a very smart, talented politician. He, during meetings with people, would get very intense and angry, and the second they would leave, he would turn it right back off, because it was just, to him, a show of dominance, really, more of an act. So a very smart, calculating politician.
Like Martin Van Buren, who also didn't come from privilege, because Van Buren went to a one-room schoolhouse until age 14, then jumped straight into a lawyer's office as an apprentice, where he grinded through legal work for 7 years until being admitted to the bar. And even though he never went to college, Van Buren was a highly skilled lawyer who became New York's Attorney General before the age of 30. However, William Henry...
Again, Van Buren's in that group of people with like John Quincy Adams or James Buchanan or Herbert Hoover, who on paper was super qualified to be president. Van Buren was someone who had, again, done basically every job in politics you could do to be the president, and was handpicked by Jackson to kind of take the charge after his 2 terms, but he ends up presiding over a lot of the issues of Jackson's presidency. The majority of the Trail of Tears falls in his lap, which he certainly approved of. The rejection of the charter of the Bank of the United States leads to the Panic of 1837. That falls into Van Buren's lap, even though he didn't sign off on it. So a lot of that drags his presidency down for things that weren't necessarily his doing, whether or not he agreed with them.
Harrison did give college a shot. Kinda. Cause he attended Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia for about a year before moving on to study medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. But after his dad died, money got tight. So he left school and traded the textbooks for a sword and enlisted in the army, where his battlefield career eventually took off. See? Who says he needs school to become president? Oh, hey there. Well, John Tyler...
Tippecanoe, again, William Henry Harrison is someone who gains national prominence from his exploits as a military leader. John Tyler was kind of just along for the ride as his VP.
His dad set him up for success early. Cause at just 12 years old, he entered the prep program at the College of William and Mary, moved into the main school at 15, and after graduating, studied law under his father, who was a judge. And even though Tyler maybe wasn't as brilliant as the founding fathers, he had solid B+ energy. But a B+ didn't cut it for this next president, because James Polk...
Yeah, it kind of breezes over Tyler. Tyler sets up the precedent we have of the vice president assuming powers, because the Constitution, until, what was it, the 22nd Amendment, that really sets the chain of succession, or maybe it's the 25th, sets the chain of succession officially into motion and declares that the vice president isn't merely acting as it. We've basically just been operating on precedent up until the 1970s, that the vice president becomes president and isn't just acting in that role, is the president. So Tyler, very consequential in that way, and was often ridiculed for it. He was called His Accidency instead of His Excellency, which he very much disliked.
Was the ultimate overachiever. After graduating first in his class at the University of North Carolina, Polk became a lawyer and young congressman. But
You'll see lawyer probably the most constant through line with presidents, other than like being in the military. Things like 27 presidents have a law degree.
Most impressively, before stepping into the Oval Office, Polk mapped out his entire presidency, promising to accomplish 4 major goals.
And he got every single one of them, which is good, because he dies like 4 months after leaving office.
And guess what? He achieved all 4 in one term, then refused to run again. On the other hand, Zachary Taylor didn't...
And he might have lost, because Zachary Taylor was also incredibly popular nationally from the Mexican War, where he's actually removed from command shortly beforehand by Polk because he figured that he, would become a political rival, and he probably would have. Now, Polk, again, had accomplished all of his major tasks, but that election would have been tough.
Care much about school. He received poor grades, never went to college, and his spelling was horrible. Instead, he joined the army at 23 years old and never looked back. Cause instead of reading books, he'd rather lead armies into battle. Charge! But this next president was the definition of...
Like I said, gains national prominence in the Mexican War. Someone greatly admired by people like Lee and Grant, who, you could probably say that Taylor's probably the most successful general of the Mexican War, maybe Winfield Scott, but elevated to national prominence. Sadly, only gets to see about 1.5 years of his term, which is unfortunate, because then we end up with Millard Fillmore, who's one of our not so good presidents. and also Alec Baldwin.
Self-made. Cause even though he grew up in poverty, Millard Fillmore devoured every book he could get his hands on, teaching
A lot of
himself
autodidacts
grammar,
in the history of
math,
presidency.
law, and science. And eventually was admitted to the bar in 1823. But although Fillmore never went to college himself,
You can understand back in these days, you could become a lawyer without having a law degree. That wasn't necessarily a thing at the time. You just basically had to pass a test.
he literally founded the University of Buffalo. And hey, I like that mentality. If you can't go to college, just build one. I hereby grant this diploma to myself. But
That's
speaking
funny.
of higher education, Franklin Pierce entered Bowdoin College at just 15 years old, where he studied classics, philosophy, and became best friends with Nathaniel Hawthorne, the man who'd go on to write the Scarlet Letter. But even
Very
though
good.
Pierce was a strong student, let's just say he didn't need it, cause he cruised through politics with good looks, charisma, and a gifted speaking ability. Pierce was considered the handsomest man in politics of his day,
And is actually still considered one of our more handsome presidents. You know, I'm not exactly sure who they poll those decisions, but Franklin Pierce is considered generally one of the more attractive presidents.
boy, did he know how to use it. I'm standing right here. But on to less attractive presidents. Cause James Buchanan graduated from Dickinson College with honors in just 2 years, and afterwards became a lawyer and a highly accomplished diplomat. Too bad those skills didn't translate to the Oval Office. Unlike
And again, Buchanan is probably a president who, if he had come along 30 years before or after, we would, you know, maybe consider him middle of the road now. Again, incredibly qualified to be the president, but this is also back in the days when the presidency was much more of an administrative job, and, you know, other than people like Andrew Jackson, they didn't necessarily have that idea of like the bully pulpit, or more of a populist idea. Buchanan just kind of just let things happen. He disagreed with secession, said it was illegal, but that he didn't have the authority to do anything about it. Just a very milquetoast president. And he didn't enjoy being president. Upon leaving, he tells Lincoln, if you're half as happy coming into this job as I am leaving, then you are the happiest man in the world.
Abraham Lincoln, who was a natural-born future president.
The
Because
goat.
although he had almost no formal schooling, Lincoln taught himself everything. He'd spend his nights reading books by the fireplace and pass the Illinois bar entirely on his own. He'd read
He would literally read an entire book on a walk. Like the scene in Lincoln where he's talking about Euclidean mathematics, that's real. Lincoln read Euclid's axioms and stuff and really studied that just on a whim. And he would retain things. You know, he would retain everything. I'm currently reading right now Michael Lynn's book, What Lincoln Thought. Very fantastic deep dive into Lincoln's mind and his thoughts. Also, The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner is another great book if you want to learn about what Lincoln really truly thought about things in his life and politically. A voracious reader. And this is back in the days where, you know, most of the country was agrarian, so his father would literally be like, I would have to beat him because he was just reading all the time, and the only way I could get him to do stuff was to promise to buy him a book.
Shakespeare, the Bible, poetry, and sometimes walked miles just to borrow a book. He even taught himself Euclid geometry just to sharpen his logic. Like, who does that? So despite having no teacher his entire life, Lincoln became one of the most eloquent, insightful leaders in American history. But
And eloquence is funny because at the time Lincoln was not considered a great orator in terms of comparing him to people, you know, also of just of his time, like a John C. Calhoun or some of the founders. But we look back now at the Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln himself even thought, you know, oh, the world will little remember what we say here today. But Lincoln's speeches, you know, are his inaugurals, especially his second inaugural, the Gettysburg Address. So many of his writings, which I would encourage people to read, are phenomenal.
if you thought Lincoln had it bad, Andrew Johnson somehow had it worse. 'Cause after growing up in poverty, Johnson didn't learn to read, write, or do basic arithmetic until he was a teenager, yet managed to teach himself enough law to get admitted to the Tennessee bar. Even so, Johnson used the fake it till you make it strategy to work his way up the political ladder, 'cause modern historians rank him as one of the lowest IQ presidents. Meanwhile,
I'm not sure about that per se, but he's definitely someone who's kind of in the right place at the right time. He was the only senator from the southern state who maintained loyalty. That's how he ends up being wartime governor of Tennessee. And it's an unfortunate truth that, you know, his handling of Reconstruction probably wasn't too dissimilar to Lincoln's, how it would have went. Lincoln probably wouldn't have vetoed all the things that Johnson did, but he would have been probably just as lenient.
As Grant received one of the most rigorous educations America had to offer, the United States Military Academy, where he studied engineering, math, and military science.
And you gotta remember, at this point, you know, West Point, up until the Civil War and even a little bit afterwards, is mostly just a place where you go, you know, even if you are smart enough to get into the engineering corps, you're basically just learning how to build forts. A lot of, you know, different languages are studied. There's actually not a bunch in the West Point curriculum up until the late 19th century that's actually about fighting. You know, it's basically just a uniformed, you know, school, really.
But Grant wasn't exactly a standout. He graduated 21st out of 39 cadets. Nevertheless, the West Point values were drilled into his being. Cause during the Civil War, Grant's calm judgment and strategic intelligence allowed him to lead the Union to victory.
And that's true. And actually, Grant actually wanted to be a math professor upon graduating from West Point. Didn't pan out. One of the main reasons he's so successful in the war is because he was a quartermaster during the Mexican War, which, when you can learn how to move men and move logistics and supplies, you're going to become much more successful than someone like Lee, for example, who spent 25 years in the engineering corps. Very successful general in his own right, but didn't have a lot of he didn't really have any combat experience up until the Civil War, and never really led a bunch of men. And again, that quartermaster skill is incredibly important. And of course, Grant did have, you know, more resources on his side, but it doesn't matter what you have if you don't have the ability to implement and use it effectively.
Proof that sometimes the kid with average grades becomes the one who changes history, and other times they just blend in with the pack.
Because Lee actually graduates second in his class at West Point.
Like Rutherford B. Hayes. Cause he graduated valedictorian at Kenyon College before earning his law degree at Harvard. And in his free time, enjoyed classical music, lectures, and the visual arts. So yeah, Hayes wasn't considered a genius, but definitely had a resume that made his parents proud. Unlike this next president, who quite literally was a genius. Cause James Garfield graduated from Williams College and immediately started teaching college-level math, Greek, and Latin while studying law on the side. But that's just the beginning. Cause Garfield was famously an ambidextrous multilingual. He could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time. And while serving in Congress, Garfield published an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. But even though IQ tests didn't exist back then, many historians believe Garfield was one of the smartest U.S. presidents, rivaling the intelligence of Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams. If only his presidency didn't get cut short.
I would argue Garfield was probably the smartest president we had. And if you watch Death by Lightning, I think it's one area they probably could have touched on a lot more, was emphasizing just how smart he was. They definitely show he was a smart and gifted politician and a gifted speaker, but they really could have expanded upon more of his actual intelligence and education, because it's one of his most striking features as a man. And it's such a shame that he is struck down, you know, the way he was by Charles Couteau, because his presidency probably would have been damn successful. Chester Arthur, in his own right, was a successful president, and for being a product of the spoils system, taking it on is admirable. But I think a successful, even 2 terms for James Garfield, I can't imagine how amazing that would have been.
Chester A. Arthur became president. A solid, smart guy who graduated from Union College as a top student and eventually passed the bar without law school. So yeah, Arthur was well educated, polished, and had some of the best presidential facial hair in U.S. history. But
and they kind of exaggerate a lot of his quirks in the show too.
Stay focused, because Grover
But Nick Offerman did a good job.
never went to college. He ditched high school early and learned the law the old-fashioned way, by clerking in a Buffalo law office, studying at night, and grinding through legal textbooks until he earned admission to the bar. 'Cause if you couldn't tell, Cleveland was a workhorse. He grinded from lawyer to mayor to governor to president of the United States. Proof that sometimes determination beats a diploma. Which is great news for me, 'cause I barely made it through the Secret Service Academy. But I work hard, sir. I make up for it with work ethic. Don't I? I'm just gonna shut up now. Let's move on to Benjamin Harrison.
And of course, Cleveland's the first president to have 2 non-consecutive terms. And a fairly successful president. You could understand why. You just went over his extensive list of qualifications.
A well-educated gentleman who graduated near the top of his class at Miami University in Ohio. He studied classics, science, and mathematics, and later attended Cincinnati Law School, where he built a successful law career. Solid credentials, solid career. And well, everything was pretty solid with Harrison. Kind of like William McKinley, who attended Allegheny College before the Civil War pulled him out of the classroom and into the Union Army. And after the war...
And McKinley's actually the last in the line of presidents, starting with Grant. And I guess, well, starting with Grant, leads all the way to McKinley, where they were also, generals in the Civil War. Garfield, Hayes, all of them were Civil War generals.
McKinley graduated from Albany Law School. However, McKinley's true superpower was his remarkable memory for numbers. He could recall tariff data with his feet on the desk. And this was a big deal in a world without calculators. 'Cause it was his brain that propelled the McKinley Tariff, one of the most complex trade laws in U.S. history. But speaking of big brain...
And McKinley was incredibly popular in his time. And a lot of that had to do, despite his imperialist tendencies, which were certainly in line with his time, the economy thrived under William McKinley.
Teddy Roosevelt was one of the most highly educated presidents in American history. He graduated from Harvard with honors and briefly enrolled in Columbia Law School before jumping into politics, 'cause sitting still wasn't really his thing. But boy, did Teddy always make time to read. On trains, horseback, and even during meetings. Teddy's reading speed was so legendary, he finished a book a day. And I think that somehow rewired his brain, because he also had a true photographic memory. He could glance at any book and repeat the entire thing weeks later. His memory was so strong, my memory erasing device never worked on him. Sorry, sir. Let's move.
You'd be damn foolish and a little, brave to mess with Teddy Roosevelt that way. The man built a boat by hand. It got stolen. He built another boat by hand, tracked the guys down, beat them up, and brought them to justice.
On to William Howard Taft, who graduated from Yale second in his class and won the gold medal for oratory and the gold medal for civil engineering. But Taft quickly evolved into a constitutional powerhouse. 'Cause after graduating from Cincinnati Law School, he grew to become the best government lawyer of his era. This not only landed him the top job of POTUS, but afterwards, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person to ever hold both positions. Teddy Roosevelt even said, Taft has one of the best legal minds in America. Sound, thorough, and fearless. So yeah, Taft was pretty dang smart. Kinda like...
Not much to add there, and he ends up serving on the Supreme Court for several years, and there have been talks of other presidents serving. Salmon Chase, who was Chief Justice from 1864 on for about 15-20 years, attempted to challenge Lincoln for the nomination in 64, but generally speaking, other than I think mostly in jest, like President Obama, because he was a constitutional teacher and constitutional professor, no one's really floated the idea of appointing a president to the Supreme Court.
Woodrow Wilson, who might have been the most educated president in U.S. history, because Wilson graduated from Princeton and then earned his Ph.D. in political science from Johns Hopkins. And Wilson loved college so much, he never wanted to leave.
A Ph.D. in history.
To become a professor and president of Princeton University, which was quite unusual for the time, because in the late 1800s, only 2% of Americans stepped foot in a college classroom. And somehow, Warren G.
And while Wilson had a Ph.D. in history, he was definitely skewed in his viewing. He was a what you would have called, you know, an unreconstructed Southern. He's born in the South. He ends up getting elected to governor and the presidency from New Jersey, but definitely some lost cause tendencies in his history.
Harding was one of them. He started in a one-room schoolhouse, attended Ohio Central College, and became one of the most popular kids on campus. But Harding wasn't much of a scholar. He was a great communicator who preferred giving speeches over reading books.
Very charismatic and popular.
Studies place Harding among the lowest IQ presidents. But hey, he was likable, and that counts for something, right? Kinda like Calvin Coolidge, who graduated from Amherst College, winning awards for both oratory and debate, which is ironic given that he later became famous for not talking.
And I've said this before, but he gave a speech on July 4th, which was actually his birthday, and I believe it's in 1928. It's a speech about, you know, basically what America means, you know, to him and to the world at large. It's a fantastic speech that I recommend everyone, you know, try to find and read.
Silent Cow read law, passed the bar, and had a respectable education. But because he was so quiet, people just assumed he didn't know the answers. So modern historians rank him amongst the lowest IQ presidents as a result. Don't worry, Cal, you're more of a silent but deadly type.
And that's not fair. An interesting fact, he actually gets sworn in as president by his dad, who was a federal judge.
Like that about you. But let's take things up a notch with Herbert Hoover, who became one of America's earliest STEM millionaires. Because Hoover enrolled in Stanford University's very first class and earned a BS in geology. But after college, he became a world-class mining engineer, traveling the globe, speaking multiple languages, and becoming a self-made millionaire all before entering politics. Hoover was one of the few presidents who turned his education into massive real-world success. Unlike Franklin Roosevelt.
And, you know, again, it's sad how unsuccessful he was as president because he was saddled with economic issues, which he did make worse. But during World War I, he was actually involved in logistics and was responsible for kind of organizing different things. And you would have expected a better performance out of him as president.
Who took the classic East Coast elite route. Cause he attended the prestigious Groton School, Harvard College, and then Columbia Law School, before dropping out because he thought it was too boring. Psst, sir, wake up! The professor's coming! But even after dropping out, FDR passed the bar and practiced law. He wasn't an academic like Wilson, but more of a brilliant political mind. A master of building coalitions, managing egos, and sensing the public mood. Some things you just can't teach in the classroom. And Harry Truman.
That's true, and of course comes from the prestigious Roosevelt family. Very, very smart and educated. Ends up serving some time in the Navy, and then ends up as, I believe, the governor of New York. I know he failed once getting, but I think he's finally elected governor of New York before becoming the president.
Truman could absolutely relate, because he briefly attended 2 business colleges in Kansas City before dropping out to work on his parents' farm. You see, Truman didn't need school. He just taught himself. Before 14 years old, little Truman read every book in the local library, practiced piano for 2 hours every day, and had a near photographic memory. Not bad for a kid from rural Missouri.
And damn successful in his artillery regiment in World War I, where he serves as a captain. And actually might have been an infantry unit. I have to go back and brush up on my David McCullough. But Truman also ends up on a Senate committee where he becomes renowned for his preparedness. One time he was going to have a vote on something to do with train infrastructure, and he goes to the Library of Congress and gets every book about trains and railroads and reads them all just so he would be prepared, which would certainly be an anomaly now just as it was then. And he ends up being the chair of this committee eventually, where he becomes notorious in D.C. because basically everyone knows you're not going to get anything over on Harry Truman. He's too smart and prepared.
On the other hand, Dwight Eisenhower went to the United States Military Academy and graduated from the famous Class from the Stars, a class that produced a freakishly high number of future generals. What's up, boys? We hitting the weights later? Anyway, there he studied engineering, math, and military tactics, finishing 61st out of 164 cadets, so middle of the pack. 'Cause hey, Eisenhower preferred solving problems on the battlefield. But up next...
Kind of. He never actually is in combat, and he doesn't directly lead people in the field. But again, excellent commander and one of our more successful generals, which helps propel him to the presidency, because both parties were courting him in 1952 to be the nominee. And despite what he says about being a Republican, his governance was not very conservative, to say the least. He was very much a big government kind of president.
John F. Kennedy was truly one of a kind. 'Cause he graduated from Harvard, wrote a senior thesis so good it was published as a book, and was a full-on speed reader, cruising through 1,200 words a minute, more than 3 times the average adult rate. But what really set JFK apart was his combo of brains, charm, and charisma. I mean, just look how handsome he is. Looking good today, sir. Mighty fine weather we're having. Meanwhile, Lyndon...
No, not much to add. They're like you would expect from any Massachusetts-born politician. Like, he and all of his brothers and his family, they all go to Harvard, and they're all incredibly intelligent. JFK also serves in World War II and ends up... basically, his dad buys the Senate seat from Massachusetts, which he serves in until he becomes president, and then his brother takes over shortly thereafter.
Johnson graduated from Texas State University and then took night classes at Georgetown Law, but never graduated. Instead, LBJ had an extremely high emotional intelligence. He could walk into a room of 100 senators and instantly know who was angry, scared, or drunk. And once he found your weakness, he would push that pressure point until he got what he wanted. Kind of like Richard.
And if you watch What It Takes with Bryan Cranston playing LBJ, you kind of see that the way he catches people off guard. He was a very large, intimidating man, but he would, be using the bathroom with the door open during meetings. He would, have his genitals hanging out. He would bribe you with his cufflinks and make you feel like $1 million. The man was a master with people, which is quite sad because he himself was pretty unconfident in his abilities and was always very paranoid, in the same way that Nixon was, that people were always coming after him and conspiring against him. And it's, so sad that he ends up resigning, or deciding not to run again in '68, which probably works out for the best because he dies shortly after what would have been his second term, and the stress of that second term likely would have induced an earlier heart attack than the one he actually had.
Nixon, who graduated from Whittier College and Duke University School of Law. He was disciplined, relentless, and a legitimately talented musician. Because he could play piano, violin, saxophone, clarinet, and accordion. He even composed his own piece, which he played with the National Symphony Orchestra. Sir, I feel like no one sees your soft side enough. But...
I don't know about soft side per se, but Nixon, definitely a very smart man. One of our smarter presidents. He does a series of interviews in the 80s and 90s after he leaves the presidency, and I suggest you just look up even some of them, and it just demonstrates such a ferociously intelligent man, especially when it comes to the minds of other politicians and foreign policy, which he thrived in.
While some presidents were in the band, others were on the football team, because Gerald Ford
was a star athlete,
University of Michigan, and was a star football player, captain, and led the Wolverines to 2 national championships. Afterwards, he attended Yale Law School and even coached Yale's football team on the side. Sir, I'm open! I'm open!
Very underrated president.
But while Ford was an All-American student athlete, Jimmy Carter attended Georgia Southwestern College and Georgia Tech, and then earned an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy, where he studied engineering and naval science until graduating 59th
out of
820. But Carter really kicked into overdrive after graduation, cause he became a submariner and trained in the Navy's elite nuclear propulsion program, one of the most demanding technical tracks in the U.S. military. Sheesh, this stuff is hard. I'm gonna go work on something a bit easier with my boy Ronald Reagan. Because Reagan graduated from Eureka College with a degree in economics and sociology. He played football, led student protest, and earned a reputation as a decent student. This is a lot more my speed, sir. But even though Reagan went on to become a Hollywood actor, he was also a voracious reader, crushing books every morning and every night. Meanwhile...
I guess too bad he didn't listen to him, because his presidency left a lot to be desired.
George H.W. Bush served as a Navy pilot in World War II before attending Yale. He was sharp, disciplined, and developed into one of the smartest foreign policy presidents in U.S. history. I mean, his resume before becoming president was just insane. But speaking of impressive
and Bush is a very underrated president. He gets, in many ways, he's Reagan light in the sense that a lot of the agenda items continue over the same, but he lacks a lot of Reagan's charisma, and substantially smarter. And Bush doesn't necessarily get credit for the fall of the Soviet Union because he was there when it happened, but Bush, probably a good middle-of-the-road president. Him and Clinton are kind of the same side of the two sides of the same coin, in the way that Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter are also two sides of the same coin.
resumes, check out Bill Clinton's background. He graduated from Georgetown University as class president, won the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship, and went on to
The only Rhodes Scholar president.
Oxford University, then earned his law degree from Yale, where he was a standout student. And like many other U.S. presidents, Clinton was a voracious reader and had a near photographic memory. Sir, I've been rereading the same sentence for the past 20 minutes. Can you help me out? Anyways, like his father, George W.
Clinton, again, one of our smarter presidents, and people don't often think of him that way because of his sort of laid-back, almost, crack a beer with kind of personality. But if you watch a lot of his interviews from like 2008 and on, when he's talking about just a variety of different issues, and you hear him speak, very coherently and extemporaneously off the top of his head on these topics, you realize just how smart he really is.
Bush graduated from Yale University and later got an MBA from Harvard Business School. And yeah, he might not have been the sharpest tool in the shed, but he had the credentials and name recognition to find himself in the most powerful position in the history of the world. Sir,
and he probably wouldn't have gotten it had his father not been president.
I don't know if you were paying attention earlier. Just don't press the red button, okay? On the flip side, Barack Obama began his college days at Occidental College before transferring to Columbia to get a degree in political science. And afterwards, he enrolled at Harvard Law School, became the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, and graduated magna cum laude. Pretty impressive, sir. Yet it was Obama's smarts combined with his natural public speaking skills that really launched him into the White House. Kind of like Donald
constitutional
Trump,
law.
because he attended Fordham University for 2 years before transferring to the Wharton School at UPenn, where he graduated with a degree in economics. And sure, his grades were average, but Trump would never admit that, because his real strengths showed up in the business world, where he had a strong name-face memory, elite marketing instincts, and even his critics acknowledge very high social intelligence. Trump could improv with reporters, verbally spar with opponents, and work a crowd like a stand-up comedian. In fact, one of his jokes aimed at the next president's education. Cause Joe Biden graduated in the bottom 25% of his class at the University of Delaware, and then in the bottom 12% of his class at Syracuse Law. But hey, Biden's pretty open about his mediocre performance, chalking it up to partying, playing sports, and cramming for tests at the last minute. Isn't that what most of us did in college anyway? You're just like us, sir. But speaking of doing the job with a hangover, this is every U.S. president's favorite drink. From showing up hammered at inauguration, to installing a secret Diet Coke button in the Oval Office, to pre-gaming cabinet meetings with orange...
Maybe we'll cover that one next time. So that was a pretty good video. Very, concise and summarized, but very educational. I guess I got that wrong at the beginning with it ended up being Biden, not Bush, but Bush was definitely a party animal back in his day. Let me know what you thought about that. I am a big fan of Agent Flappy's videos. They're funny, they're well animated, and they're well put together. And I'm probably gonna just for kicks and giggles, as we say in Taekwondo, take a look at this one where he discusses every president's favorite drink. But let me know what you thought about that down below. If you got any videos you'd like to see me react to in the future, drop them down there too. And until next time, remember, never stop learning.